I didn't say a word when they handed me that eviction notice. Not one. Instead, I slid the 1923 water rights deed across the table and watched the smug faces of bureaucrats, pale as if they'd just seen a ghost from history itself. They had no idea what it meant. They didn't know that 35 shiny McMansions had just been transformed into lakefront property with a single piece of yellowed paper. The Willowbrook Estates HOA thought they could strong-arm me out of my grandfather's farm while I was deployed overseas. But what they didn't know was that I'm not just a veteran. I'm an Army Corps engineer. And on my land, the laws of water and gravity had more authority than any HOA board member with a tennis racket. This is the story of how one suburban HOA tried to steal land that had been in my family for generations, and how they ended up drowning in their own greed. If you enjoy watching arrogant HOAs collapse under the weight of their own corruption, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Let me introduce myself. My name's Jake Morrison, 34 years old, Army Corps of Engineers, third-generation owner of 47 acres of rolling Texas land just outside Austin. My grandfather, pops to everyone who knew him, bought this place back in 1955. He was the kind of man who believed in stewardship, not just ownership. In 1978, he built a small earth dam on the property. It wasn't much to look at, but it was solid engineering, designed with help from the Army Corps to collect rainwater for cattle and stabilize water flow for neighbors downstream. Pops always said the back 40 acres would be worth something one day. But until then, it was where he taught me how to hunt, how to respect the land, and how to recognize the sound of water moving through soil, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Then came Afghanistan. To tours, my specialty, water management and infrastructure. Building wells in deserts teaches you how precious water really is, how fast people will fight over it, and how sometimes the person with the shovel has more power than the person with the gun. When I came home in 2023, Pops was gone. My sister Sarah, well-meaning but clueless about Texas law, had been managing the property from California. She hired a management company to handle the taxes, but never once looked at the assessments. That mistake opened the door for the Willowbrook Estates HOA. Enter Margaret Maggie Thornwell, 52 years old, president of the HOA. The kind of woman who wears pearls with her tennis skirts and thinks a golf cart makes her royalty. Her husband Rick, city councilman, a man who used zoning ordinances like weapons to crush anyone who stood in the way of their suburban empire. Together, they had a plan: absorb my land, rezone it, and turn Pops's back 40 into their next playground for the wealthy. I drove back to Texas, excited to finally settle on my land. Instead of wide pastures, I found survey stakes and concrete trucks carving scars into the earth. A foreman told me it was Willowbrook Estates property now. My boots sank into the gravel with each angry step I took. I called the police. Officer Martinez came, looking uncomfortable, and explained the HOA had filed something called adverse possession. A dusty old law, meant to keep land from sitting empty, had become their weapon of choice. And apparently, because I'd been overseas, they thought they could take what wasn't theirs. That's when Maggie appeared in her golf cart, smiling like she was doing me a favor. Her syrupy voice nearly made me laugh. "Your family abandoned this land," she said. But I wasn't laughing when I saw what her crews had done. They had diverted the creek that fed Pops's dam. The water level was dropping every day. 45 years of careful water management was being destroyed, so her subdivision could have pretty lawns and decorative ponds. I hired a lawyer. Waste of time. He wanted 85 grand just to file a zoning challenge. Meanwhile, Rick had already pushed through a fast-track zoning modification. My land had been reclassified from agriculture to residential development while I was overseas. Convenient, right? So I did what I was trained to do. I went digging, not in the soil, but in the courthouse records. And that's where I struck gold. Pops's original 1978 permits showed federal involvement, which meant federal jurisdiction. The HOA couldn't touch it. Even better, I found something older. A 1923 deed granting my great-grandfather senior water rights to the entire Willow Creek watershed. These rights were older than the city itself, older than the county, older than every one of those houses sitting downstream. That meant the HOA wasn't just trespassing on my land. They were stealing my water. And that's when I knew this wasn't just a fight over land. This was going to be war. But Maggie wasn't going to make it easy. She staged HOA meetings, painting me as a dangerous veteran. She got herself on the evening news, warning that Pops's dam was a ticking time bomb ready to burst. She claimed she was protecting the children. Her crews worked double shifts, racing to pour concrete before I could stop them. And every night, The water level sank lower. But I had something she didn't: training, patience, and federal law on my side. I set up trail cameras, took water measurements, documented everything, and the more I dug, the more her scheme unraveled. This wasn't her first land grab. She'd pulled the same stunt in Houston and left just ahead of federal investigators. The crunch of gravel outside my window became my alarm clock. Every morning, more trucks. Every night, more water gone. She thought intimidation and bureaucracy would break me. Noise complaints, inspections, harassment. But every time her people came at me, I fought back harder. Then came the letter. Eminent domain. The city was planning to seize my property for public safety. My land, my dam, my family's legacy, all set to vanish in 2 weeks unless I accepted their insult of an offer. Maggie even told the local paper, "Sometimes you have to protect the community from itself." That night, storm clouds rolled in over the hills, and as lightning cracked across the sky, I realized something. Maggie had made one critical mistake. She built her empire downstream from an engineer who knows exactly what water can do when gravity takes over. And so, as the rain began to fall, I made my decision. This wasn't just about saving Pops's land anymore. It was about reminding Maggie and her army of pearl-wearing suburban tyrants what happens when you build your future on stolen water. Because when the gates open, gravity always wins. The first salvo in Willowbrook Estates war wasn't made with bulldozers or bat. It was made with bureaucracy. Maggie Thornwell understood that paperwork, harassment, and whispers in the right ears could cripple a man faster than a lawsuit. She knew how to grind people down with red tape, smear campaigns, and neighborly intimidation. What she didn't realize was that I'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan learning exactly how insurgencies were conned. This HOA was nothing more than a suburban insurgency in tennis skirts and city council suits. The harassment began small. A loud music complaint after I played the radio during fence repairs. An anonymous tip to the health department about a supposedly unsafe septic system that had just passed inspection months earlier. A code violation citation for an unsightly shed that had been standing since 1962. Each notice came with fees. Each inspection came with threats. They were trying to bleed me dry through 1,000 cuts. Then came the wellness check. Rick Thornwell used his city council position to label me a troubled veteran. A social worker arrived on my doorstep with a clipboard, clearly uncomfortable but forced to ask me intrusive questions while Maggie parked her golf cart at the property line, watching the entire charade like a queen overseeing her pawns. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to make me look unstable. But all she did was remind me of every time we'd set up a defensive perimeter overseas. Because that's exactly what this had become. But harassment was only half the strategy. Maggie escalated to surveillance. 3 HOA board members began parking their SUVs at the end of my driveway, wearing matching polo shirts that said Neighborhood Safety Patrol. They photographed my visitors, wrote down license plates, and filed police reports about suspicious activity. They wanted to make me feel surrounded, outnumbered, and alone. But instead of feeling cornered, I started documenting them in return. Trail cameras, timestamped photos, drone footage. Every intimidation tactic they used became another piece of evidence I added to a growing case file. Behind the scenes, their real game was money. Construction crews doubled their pace, laying foundations at night under Every morning, I woke to the vibration of heavy machinery rolling past my windows. They were racing against time. If they could finish enough of the development before federal agencies stepped in, the houses would be occupied, and tearing them down would be politically impossible. That was their strategy. Build fast, build dirty, and lock in their claim before anyone could stop them. I dug deeper into the records, spending long nights at the courthouse with stale coffee and the hum of fluorescent lights above me. That's when I discovered the floodplain maps. Willowbrook Estates wasn't just built on my stolen land. It was built inside what the Army Corps classified as a 100-year floodplain. No insurance company would touch those homes without a mitigation plan. And what was their plan? Divert Willow Creek permanently into my property, letting my land absorb the floods while their manicured lawns stayed dry. The more I learned, the clearer it became. This wasn't just theft, it was fraud. They'd lied to insurance companies, lied to banks, lied to the city. And if I played this right, those lies could bury them. But Maggie wasn't done tightening the screws. She organized a smear campaign on the Nextdoor app, warning neighbors about an unstable individual with access to dangerous equipment. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. In a town this size, everyone knew exactly who she meant. I became the subject of whispers at diners, stares at the grocery store, even quiet questions at the feed store, where I'd shopped for years. And then came the big blow. A certified letter from the city. They were preparing an eminent domain seizure, citing public safety concerns with Pops's dam. The hearing was scheduled for just 2 weeks away. The message was clear: sell cheap or lose everything. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the certified letter in one hand and Pops's old journal in the other. Outside, the sound of diesel engines rumbled as construction crews poured yet another foundation on what used to be my pasture. The dam's waterline was lower than ever. I thought about Pops's words, written in his neat handwriting decades ago. The dam is here to help the community, not hurt it. That's when I made the call. My old army buddy, Tony Riggs, now worked for the EPA. 20 minutes on the phone with him taught me more about environmental law than that expensive lawyer had in weeks. Diverting a natural waterway without federal permits. That was a Clean Water Act violation. Building in a floodplain without proper assessments. Federal insurance fraud. Maggie had declared war, but I had just brought in reinforcements. From that day on, I stopped reacting and started planning. I measured every drop of diverted water, 1,200 gallons a day. I recorded video of dying creek beds, dry stock ponds, and neighbors' fields turning to dust. I gathered a list: Mrs. Chen, whose ancestral garden had withered, Miguel Santos, whose family farm had been destroyed by zoning changes, and others who had been crushed under the HOA's grip. One by one, they joined me, bringing stories, photos, and documentation. Maggie had built an empire of intimidation, but she hadn't counted on her victims uniting. And then, the weather shifted. Dark clouds began to gather, heavy with late summer rain. Pops's dam swelled with millions of gallons of water, and for the first time, I thought about the spillway gates. Built in 1978, designed for controlled releases. They hadn't been opened in decades. They were built for moments like this, for restoring balance when water was stolen. But Maggie, meanwhile, made her boldest move yet. She called in her final weapon, Rick, as city councilman. He announced an emergency zoning session, where the council would vote to condemn my property. The local paper ran the headline the next morning: Troubled Veteran Threatens Community Progress. They published a photo of my farmhouse that made it look like a derelict shack, casting me as the villain in my own story. But I wasn't the villain. I was the dam, the creek, the legacy of every farmer and neighbor who had relied on Pops's careful stewardship of the land. And if Maggie thought she could drown me in bureaucracy, she was about to learn what happens when water and truth come roaring back in full force. As the storm clouds built over the horizon, I ran my hand along the cold steel of the spillway controls. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the unthinkable. Maybe the only way to prove my case was to let nature show what it always wanted to do. Maybe it was time to open the gates. Because one thing I learned in Afghanistan still held true back home in Texas. If you want to defeat corruption, sometimes you don't fight it head, sometimes you let gravity do the work for you. Storm clouds gathered over Willowbrook Estates like an omen. For weeks, I had watched the water level in Pops's dam rise, with every rainfall, creeping closer to the old spillway gates that hadn't been touched since 1982. The dam was more than a structure of earth and steel. It was a living reminder of my grandfather's foresight, of a time when neighbors looked out for each other, instead of trying to crush one another under lawsuits and zoning maps. Pops had built the dam to sustain life during droughts, to keep cattle watered, to stabilize the creek for downstream farmers, and now, it sat like a coiled spring, full of potential energy, waiting for someone foolish enough to build a suburban empire in its shadow. Maggie Thornwell had crossed that line. She had cut off the creek's flow, drained the dam for her ornamental fountains, and tried to erase a legacy with bulldozers. But water doesn't forget its path, and neither did I. The harassment campaign escalated as the clouds thickened. Maggie's HOA patrols parked themselves outside my driveway 24 hours a day, live streaming every move I made. They called it protecting the neighborhood. I called it what it was: surveillance and intimidation. When that didn't break me, they escalated again. I woke one morning to find the spillway access padlocks filled with quickset concrete. Someone had tried to sabotage the controls. It was a deliberate attempt to make dam operations impossible, a reckless act that could have endangered the entire community if heavy rains overwhelmed the structure. But I wasn't rattled. I had expected sabotage. I documented everything: photographs, time-stamped video, even drone footage of the saboteurs sneaking onto my property in the dead of night. Evidence piled higher every day, and with each act of aggression, Maggie's case grew weaker. The legal front wasn't much better for them. Amanda Cross, an environmental lawyer who had taken up my case, filed a series of motions that hit the HOA like hammer blows. Federal agencies were now officially reviewing the creek diversion. Banking regulators were quietly asking questions about the HOA's insurance policies. Maggie had been able to buy influence at the county courthouse, but federal scrutiny was a different animal. It wasn't something you could wave away with pearls and crocodile tears. Still, the HOA raced against the clock. Their construction crews poured foundations on top of the old creek bed, slapping together walls at record speed. I knew their game. Once families moved in, tearing down houses would become politically impossible, no matter how illegal the development was. They wanted to create facts on the ground before the law caught up to them. But Pops's journals gave me both the moral clarity and the legal cover I needed. Tucked into the attic, beneath stacks of yellowed maps, I found his notes from the dam's construction in 1978. In neat block handwriting, he had recorded the covenant attached to the project. The dam operator shall maintain seasonal flow patterns to preserve downstream agricultural water rights. It wasn't just a right, it was a duty. The law required me to open the gates when necessary to restore water downstream. That duty became my shield. If anyone tried to stop me, I could prove I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was fulfilling a legal and moral obligation older than any HOA rulebook. The storm forecast sealed it. Heavy rains were predicted for the coming weekend, the kind of downpour that could turn creeks into rivers overnight. Maggie thought she could block the creek forever with concrete and landscaping stones. But Pops had designed the dam for exactly this situation. The spillway could handle a controlled release that would restore Willow Creek to its natural channel, washing away every fraudulent diversion Maggie had built. Preparation became my obsession. I spent nights servicing the hydraulic controls, replacing seals, and clearing debris from the spillway channel. The smell of machine oil and the cold bite of steel against my palms reminded me of maintenance days overseas, when failing equipment could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. This was no different. Precision was everything. I built a release plan down to the minute. 4 hours of gradual flow increase, enough to restore the creek without causing property damage. A perfect demonstration of how water naturally wanted to move through the land. I notified the volunteer fire department, posted warning signs along the downstream areas, coordinated with neighbors who had been victimized by the diversion. This wasn't reckless vengeance. It was engineering, law, and community all working together. But Maggie wasn't blind. She sensed something was coming. Her HOA filed an emergency motion with Judge Walsh, Rick's golfing buddy, demanding a restraining order against me. They claimed I was preparing an act of environmental terrorism. They even brought in a psychiatrist who had never met me, but was willing to diagnose combat-induced revenge fantasies for the right price. It was laughable, but dangerous. Walsh scheduled a hearing at sunrise, just hours before the rains were expected to crest the dam. Amanda worked all night, filing motions for the judge's recusal, presenting federal documentation, even arranging for EPA agents to attend. We knew the HOA's strategy: delay, intimidate, and hope the storm passed before I could act. But I had been in this situation before. In war zones, you learn that windows of opportunity don't last long. Sometimes you only get one shot. The morning of the storm, I stood at the dam, in the pale orange light of dawn. Clouds swirled overhead, thick and heavy. The air smelled like rain and electricity. My hands rested on the cold levers of the spillway controls. Downstream, Maggie's golf cart brigade had assembled, holding up "Protect Our Kids" signs, live-streaming their outrage to anyone who would listen. They were waiting for me to crack, to lose my temper, to confirm their narrative of a dangerous veteran. But I wasn't angry. I was focused. At 7:02 a.m., I opened the gates to 25% capacity. The sound was like music, not a violent roar, but a steady rush of water rediscovering its path, flowing where it had always belonged. Willow Creek came alive again, trickling through dry channels, rehydrating fields, filling stock ponds, and bringing tears to the eyes of neighbors who hadn't seen water on their land in 18 months. Federal agents filmed everything. EPA officer Sarah Kim measured the flow and confirmed it matched historical patterns exactly. Farmers downstream collected water samples, photographs, and video. The evidence was undeniable. I wasn't flooding anyone. I was restoring the creek to what it had always been. Maggie, of course, lost her composure. She screamed at the agents, called me a terrorist, and demanded my arrest. She accused me of weaponizing water like it was Afghanistan all over again. But the cameras captured it, all her hysteria, my calm, and the undeniable truth of water flowing in its natural bed. For the first time, the narrative shifted. I wasn't the villain anymore. I was the steward, the caretaker, the man honoring his grandfather's legacy by doing exactly what the law required. And Maggie, she was revealed as what she truly was. A suburban tyrant who thought she could fight gravity with paperwork and entitlement. As rain began to fall in heavy sheets, the creek widened, stronger and louder. It was proof in motion, nature, testifying on my behalf. But this was only the beginning. Because as Maggie's voice cracked on live streams, and Rick shouted into his phone at panicked contractors, I realized something chilling. They weren't going to give up after one setback. They were too invested, too greedy, too desperate. And desperate people don't retreat. They escalate. The spillway gates had turned the tide literally. For the first time in months, Willow Creek flowed where it was supposed to. Farmers downstream celebrated as their stock ponds refilled. Mrs. Chen's withered garden soaked up life-giving water again. Even the reporters who had once called me a troubled veteran now stood in my fields, cameras rolling, documenting the creek's return as if it were a miracle. But if I'd learned anything about Maggie Thull, it was that she didn't accept defeat. She doubled down, every time, and this time, desperation drove her further than ever before. The HOA's first move was sabotage. My trail cameras caught them in the act, 3 men in tactical gear, creeping across my property at 2 in the morning with buckets of concrete mix. Their plan was crude but dangerous. Jammed the spillway gates so they couldn't be closed properly. One of them poured quickset into the hydraulic channels, while another stood watch with a flashlight taped to his rifle. They thought no one was watching. They were wrong. Deputy Rodriguez, tipped off by my EPA contact Tony Riggs, was waiting in the shadows. The arrests were swift, the evidence undeniable. Still, Maggie spun the incident as community volunteers trying to secure dangerous infrastructure. But even the local news anchors raised eyebrows when asked why concerned. Citizens needed night vision goggles and military surplus vests to protect a dam. When sabotage didn't work, Maggie turned to the courts. Rick Thornwell pushed an emergency motion through Judge Walsh, claiming my controlled release had caused $2.7 million in flood damage. Their attorneys paraded photos of muddy construction sites, half-built homes sitting in puddles, and ornamental landscaping stones washed out of place. To them, that was catastrophic flooding. Amanda Cross tore their argument apart. She presented Pops's covenant, requiring seasonal water releases. She showed EPA measurements, proving the creek was flowing exactly within historical boundaries. She reminded the court that Maggie's own crews had illegally blocked the channel, creating artificial hazards. Every claim the HOA made collapsed under federal evidence. Still, Maggie played the victim, her voice trembling as she testified. She claimed she feared for her life, that I had used military tactics to terrorize innocent families. She painted me as unstable, violent, a man incapable of living in society. The performance might have fooled a sympathetic audience. But this time, cameras captured the contraster theatrics against my calm, documented preparation. The public narrative was slipping from her grasp, and she knew it, so she escalated again. The HOA organized a protest at my property line, complete with folding chairs, coolers, and signs that read, "Protect our kids." Families camped out overnight, live streaming themselves as if they were standing against a natural disaster. But when the rains came, their staged drama unraveled. Instead of catastrophic flooding, the water flowed neatly back into Willow Creek, bypassing their protest site entirely. By the next morning, even some of Maggie's own supporters packed up their chairs and went home, embarrassed to be part of her charade. But Rick wasn't finished playing his hand. Using his city council authority, he declared my dam an imminent public hazard, ordering the fire department to secure it. Chief Martinez, a man with more integrity than Rick ever dreamed of, pulled me aside. He admitted the order was political, not practical. "You've got 6 hours before they try to shut you down," he warned. "Make it count." Those 6 hours mattered more than Maggie realized. During that time, Amanda filed whistleblower complaints with state regulators, presenting evidence of fraudulent insurance claims tied to the HOA's development. Without valid coverage, their construction had to stop immediately. The Texas Insurance Commission froze their policies, and for the first time, financial pressure cracked the HOA's foundation. Maggie's mask slipped completely. She no longer hid behind pearl necklaces and polite smiles. She screamed at contractors, berated her board members, and even stormed into a city council meeting accusing federal agents of conspiring against her. Reporters, once cautious, now treated her like a spectacle, documenting every meltdown for the evening news. But the cruelest move came just before dawn. Maggie contacted Veterans Mental Health Services, claiming I had made suicidal threats and needed to be taken into custody. At 5:30 a.m., a VA social worker knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, asking if I was a danger to myself or others. Behind her, Maggie sat smugly in her golf cart, live streaming the encounter to her followers. It was a setup. If I lost my temper, if I so much as raised my voice, it would be the confirmation she needed to brand me unstable. But Pops had raised me better than that. I stayed calm, answered the social worker's questions with clarity, even invited her inside to see the meticulous plans I'd drawn for dam operations. She apologized as she left, visibly frustrated at being used as a pawn. Maggie's livestream meant to humiliate me. Instead showed a veteran calmly explaining environmental law, while she cackled in the background. The comments section lit up with ridicule, not for me, but for her. Still, the pressure mounted. Federal investigators were due to arrive within hours, and I knew Maggie and Rick would pull one final stunt before then. They had too much to lose: millions in construction loans, political careers, reputations. If the EPA documented their violations, the fallout would be catastrophic. I checked the forecast one last time. Heavy rains would crest the dam that very morning. Perfect timing. The water volume was ideal for a demonstration, enough to prove natural flow, not enough to threaten real damage. The spillway had been serviced, the hydraulic gates ready. Everything was prepared. But I also knew Maggie's pattern. She never backed down. If sabotage, courts, protests, and character assassinations had failed, she would escalate to something even more reckless. I felt it in my bones. As the first drops of rain splattered against the farmhouse windows, I pulled on my boots and grabbed Pops's old journal from the kitchen table. His words echoed in my head. Sometimes you have to flood the valley to save the creek. Outside, the HOA's protest signs wilted in the rain. Reporters adjusted their cameras under umbrellas. Federal agents pulled up in black SUVs, stepping out with clipboards and raincoats. And at the far end of the road, Maggie appeared, shouting into her phone, her voice rising above the storm. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And as thunder rolled across the hills, I knew the next move would decide everything: land, water, and legacy. The storm broke just after sunrise, a low rumble of thunder rolling across the Texas hills like a warning shot. Rain fell steady, soaking the dry earth, feeding the swollen reservoir behind Pops's dam. The old spillway groaned under the pressure, as if reminding me it was built for this moment, for the times when water had to reclaim its path, when human arrogance had to bow to gravity. I stood at the controls in my rain jacket, Pops's journal tucked safely inside a waterproof case. Around me, the world felt suspended between two realities: the steady hum of rain on steel, and the distant chaos of Willowbrook Estates, where Maggie Thornwell's empire teetered on collapse. She had tried everything to stop me: lawsuits, protests, even weaponizing veteran services against me. But now, with federal agents and reporters standing just yards away, the stage was set. Every camera was pointed at the dam. Every notepad scribbled my name. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about narrative. Who was the villain? Who was the steward? The flood would decide. At 7:02 a.m., I gripped the cold steel levers and eased them forward. The gates creaked, reluctant after decades of stillness, then yielded with a groan. Water surged through the channels, a steady release that built into a rushing chorus. Not violent, not reckless, controlled, precise, exactly as Pops designed. The first trickles of Willow Creek found their old bed within minutes. Dry soil darkened, stones glistened, and then, as if remembering, the water accelerated, filling the channel. Farmers downstream cheered, some openly crying as ponds and fields came alive again. Miguel Santos knelt by the creek, scooping water into his weathered hands, whispering prayers of thanks. Mrs. Chen stood in silence, her garden soil drinking deeply, tears cutting lines through the rain on her cheeks. Reporters captured every second. Their broadcasts shifted mid-sentence from dangerous veteran threatened neighborhood to historic creek restoration underway. The narrative flipped live on air. But Maggie wasn't ready to surrender. She screeched across the property line in her golf cart, pearls bouncing against her raincoat, mascara running like war paint. Her voice cracked above the storm. "He's flooding our children's homes," she screamed into her phone, live streaming to her followers. "This is terrorism." Except the truth betrayed her in real time. The water stayed within the creek's natural banks. Not a single home flooded. The only property damaged belonged to Maggie herself. The illegal concrete barriers her crew had poured into the channel. They crumbled and washed away like Santa's destas. EPA officer Sarah Kim documented it all, calmly noting that the release matched historical flow data. Tony Riggs stood with his arms crossed, satisfaction written on his face as federal oversight validated everything we'd prepared. This wasn't sabotage. It was stewardship. Maggie's desperation turned manic. She called Rick, her voice shrill over the storm. Within minutes, 3 concrete trucks rolled up, trying to block the creek with accidental spills. Federal agents moved fast, arresting the drivers before they could dump their loads. Interfering with a federal environmental investigation was a felony, and the sight of handcuffed contractors being loaded into SUVs sent Maggie into a full-blown meltdown. Still, she fought to control the narrative. She shouted at reporters, waving her arms wildly, demanding they film the flooding disaster. But every lens caught the opposite: restored water flow, thriving farmland, happy neighbors. Her performance collapsed under the weight of visible truth. Rick fared no better. On a recorded call captured by Amanda Cross outside the courthouse, he ranted about property values being destroyed by that psycho. His words leaked within hours, broadcast on evening news segments, damning him as corrupt and self-serving. The mask of respectability slipped. What was once their strength, their polished image, was now their greatest weakness. But the flood wasn't just legal or symbolic. It was technical proof. For years, Maggie's HOA claimed Pops's dam was a hazard. But as the rain intensified, the structure held steady. The controlled release flowed exactly as designed, reducing pressure, preventing overflow. The dam was safer than ever. The HOA's lies drowned with every gallon that surged downstream. Neighbors who once doubted me began to switch sides. Families who had signed Maggie's petitions quietly slipped away, embarrassed by her shrieking live streams. Even some HOA residents admitted on camera that no homes were at risk, that Maggie had exaggerated for personal gain. The tide wasn't just water, it was public opinion, and it was turning fast. Still, I knew the battle wasn't finished. The flood had restored the creek, but Maggie and Rick weren't done fighting. They had too much at stake: millions in fraudulent loans, political careers built on corruption, reputations polished through intimidation. Losing here meant more than embarrassment. It meant exposure, prosecution, ruin. As I watched the creek carve its way back through the valley, a thought crystallized. This wasn't just about Pops's land anymore. It wasn't even just about water rights. It was about pulling back the curtain on an entire system of corruption. Rick's influence, Maggie's scams, the banks, the insurers, every piece connected. The flood was proof, but the courtroom would be judgment. The rain eased slightly by noon, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet soil and cedar. The creek ran steady. Calm, exactly as Pops had intended. For the first time in months, the land breathed again. But as I packed up equipment, I caught sight of Maggie, soaked, mascara streaked, pearls tangled around her neck. She glared at me with pure venom. For a moment, her lips curled into a smile, a cold, dangerous smile that told me this wasn't over. And she was right, because while the water now flowed free, the next battle wasn't going to be fought at the dam. It was going to be fought in courtrooms, banks, and council chambers, places where lies could bury the truth, lest I buried them first. The flood had won me allies, but the war was just shifting arenas. The flood changed everything. For months, Maggie Thornwell had controlled the story, painting me as a dangerous veteran, a ticking time bomb with a dam. But once the spillway gates opened and Willow Creek flowed back into its rightful channel, the truth was undeniable. Cameras didn't lie. Reporters didn't lie. The water itself didn't lie. Still, Maggie wasn't done clawing at the walls of her collapsing empire. She and Rick scrambled to spin the disaster as my crime, not theirs. Emergency motions flew through Judge Walsh's courtroom, demanding injunctions, restraining orders, even criminal charges. Their attorneys wheeled in glossy photos of mud-splattered construction sites, claiming millions in damages. They brought in so-called experts to testify about unstable veterans weaponizing water. The smear campaign hadn't ended, it had only moved indoors. The courthouse became a battlefield. On one side, Maggie, Rick, and a platoon of Houston lawyers in $1,000 suits. On the other, me, Amanda Cross, and a coalition of farmers, neighbors, and environmental groups. The gallery was packed: reporters, families, even federal agents with clipboards. It felt less like a zoning hearing and more like a trial for the soul of the community. Maggie took the stand first, dressed in black, with a string of pearls tight around her throat. Her voice trembled as she recounted my supposed threats, describing me as a man damaged by war who had turned water into a weapon of revenge. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue, pausing for the cameras at just the right moment. It was a performance, and for a moment, I almost admired her commitment to the act. But then Amanda presented the covenant. 1978 Agricultural Flood Management Agreement POPs had signed with the Army Corps of Engineers. It spelled out, in plain language, my duty to maintain seasonal flow. Not a right. A duty. The courtroom shifted instantly. The dam wasn't a weapon. It was an obligation. And I had fulfilled it exactly as intended. EPA Officer Sarah Kim testified next, confirming that the release had been controlled, measured, and entirely consistent with historical water patterns. Federal oversight trumped HOA paranoia. Tony Riggs added the nail in the coffin, detailing how the HOA's creek diversion violated multiple sections of the Clean Water Act. He didn't mince words. What Mr. Morrison did was lawful restoration. What the HOA did was theft. The evidence snowballed. Photos of Maggie's concrete barriers crumbling in the flood. Historical maps proving Willow Creek's natural channel. Insurance documents riddled with false claims. Amanda unveiled the recorded call of Rick ranting about destroying property values. His own words confirming the corruption everyone suspected. Rick exploded under cross-examination. His face flushed red as Amanda pressed him on zoning changes he'd pushed through while I was overseas. When she revealed his financial stake in the construction company, the courtroom gasped. Rick shouted, called it a federal setup, then stormed out of the witness box. Cameras captured every second of his tantrum. The respectable councilman facade crumbled into dust. But it wasn't just evidence that turned the tide. It was the people. Miguel Santos stood, voice cracking, as he described 3 generations of farming destroyed by the creek diversion. Mrs. Chen quietly showed photos of her grandfather's garden, lush before the water theft, barren after. Fire Chief Martinez testified that the spillway operation had been executed with zero safety concerns. Even the diner owner spoke, reminding the court that the creek had always fed the community long before. Maggie's HOA built manicured lawns downstream. Piece by piece, the narrative shifted. Maggie wasn't the protector of children she claimed to be. She was the thief who had stolen their water. Rick wasn't the councilman safeguarding progress. He was the profiteer building fortunes on fraud. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't posture or grandstand. I wore Pops's old cowboy hat, stood straight, and told the truth. I spoke about my grandfather's vision, about the dam's purpose, about my time overseas learning that water is life. I explained how every calculation, every release, was made not out of vengeance, but responsibility. And I looked Judge Walsh in the eye when I said it. I didn't flood anyone. I restored what was stolen. The final blow came from Amanda. She revealed that Maggie's previous HOA in Houston had already been fined $2.3 million for the exact same scheme. The courtroom erupted. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a career built on fraud. Judge Walsh, who had sat stiffly through the proceedings, finally broke his silence. His voice was measured, but the weight of his words shook the room. He denied every motion from the HOA. He ruled the spillway operation lawful and necessary. He ordered the HOA to cease interference with federal investigations. And then, with cameras rolling, he warned Rick personally. This court will not obstruct lawful environmental enforcement. You, sir, are done. Federal agents moved fast. Rick was escorted out of the courthouse under investigation for conspiracy and fraud. Maggie fled the building, refusing questions, her once flawless image in tatters. The crowd outside cheered, not for me alone, but for the creek, the land, and the people who had fought to protect it. Months later, the ripples of judgment spread wider than I could have imagined. Rick pled guilty to conspiracy and served time in federal prison. Maggie declared bankruptcy, her empire reduced to ashes. The construction company collapsed under $12 million in fines. The Willowbrook Estates HOA dissolved, replaced by a new community group that prioritized environmental stewardship over suburban tyranny. As for Pops's land, its value soared. Designated as a protected watershed, the creek thrived, wildlife returned, farms flourished. What Maggie had tried to destroy became stronger than ever. And me, I found peace I didn't know I was missing. I renovated the farmhouse, helped neighbors rebuild, even started an environmental scholarship in Pops's name. Every morning, I walked down to the dam, listened to the steady hum of water through the spillway, and remember his words. Sometimes you have to flood the valley to save the creek. This wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for everyone who has ever been crushed by corrupt HOAs, greedy developers, or bureaucratic bullies. It proved that with the right allies, the right documentation, and the courage to fight, you can win. So if you've ever battled an if you've ever felt powerless against corruption, remember Willow Creek. Remember that water always finds its way home. Drop your own HOA nightmare stories in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you want more tales of communities fighting back against greed and winning, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Because the next story I'm telling, it's about the city that tried to steal my neighbor's solar farm so she cut power to City Hall during the mayor's wedding. Trust me, you don't want to miss that one. Water finds a way, justice finds a way, and together, communities can too.